My name is Baldev Binder from Blackstone & Co. Welcome to our webinar today on crypto hacks, scams, and schemes. Today we're joined with an esteemed panel. I'll introduce you in a second. My colleague V. Kumar Sharma, who is a partner at Blackstone & Co. We've got Kevin Margetson, who is a partner in the Singapore office of Michon de Raya, London law firm Michon de Raya. Kevin specializes in dispute resolution and has got recent and fairly extensive experience in crypto disputes in particular. And we've got from Black Panda, Mr. Richie Lam. Richie is, Black Panda is a cybersecurity firm, and Richie assists them with their cybersecurity operations. So let's get started. I'll hand over the floor to Kumar to make to set the scene and so on. But today's webinar will be broken into three sections, put it this way. We will first talk about, Kumar will make an introduction as to what are the types of issues that are facing the crypto world, and I think this is particularly pertinent given events of the recent week or so. We'll talk about which entities one should pursue and how to strategize and how to come up with a war plan. The phrase war plan is something that I think is very apt when it comes to the crypto world, and I'll come to that in a reason why that's the case. The second part will then deal with the forensics behind it, the work that people like Black Panda will do in terms of identifying who the hackers are and trying to trace where the coins have gone to. And the third part, we will speak to Kevin about the tools that the law has created in terms of disclosure orders that are available to victims of frauds and of scams. Before I hand over the floor to Kumar, I just want to give my own personal sense as to what the traits are of the crypto world that has contributed or that are pertinent to bear in mind when one is looking at trying to get recovery. The crypto world seems to me to have share or to show four traits, one of which is silly money. Lots of money being pumped in. A lot of people are excited about somebody else pumping in money, a lot of venture capitalist money going in. And that actually can inflate the value of assets quite quickly. That then leaves the second trait, which is that there tends to be a lack of control or oversight over how assets are controlled and over the individuals behind some of these platforms and exchanges. The related to that then is that you have a third point, which is effectively back in the old days, back in our traditional way of thinking of things, we've got a house, we've got a lock, we've locked the house up. In the crypto space, you've got differences. In the crypto space, you've got differences because it's all cybersecurity. So you might have intentional hacking, you might have intentional dissipation, and you might have third-party hacking of the platform of which dissipation of assets can happen. And the last and the most important point, which I ask for you guys to remember, would be that the crypto world is all on the ledger, all trackable, but at the same time it's anonymous because it's hidden behind a bunch of numbers. Wallets are hidden behind a bunch of numbers, and it's borderless. And borderless is one of its biggest incentives of being in crypto, but also one of the biggest problems when it comes to getting recovery. So with that, I'll pass the floor over to Kumar, who's going to talk about industry trends and set the scene for the war plan. Over to you, Kumar.
Thanks very much, Baldev. So I just want to talk about really the scope of the problem facing the industry, and I have in front of us this chart from Chainalysis that sets out the total value hacked. That's in the blue bar graphs, and the number of hacks represented by that orange line from January 2022 to October 2022. And October 2022 was a record month this year. $718 million stolen from hacks across 11 different hacks, primarily from DeFi protocols. So DeFi protocols, to put it in very simple terms, these are platforms that allow you to lend, stake, trade your cryptocurrencies across different blockchains. And this year has been, well, it seems it's definitely going to surpass 2021. So since October, $3 billion have been stolen across 125 hacks, and 3 cross-chain bridges were breached in October. And the bulk of the assets that have been stolen in October relate to these cross-chain bridges, 600 million stolen, accounting for 82% of losses for October and 64% of losses all year. This really tells us two things. First, there is a significant move away from what hackers are targeting. In the past, in 2019, most of the targets for cryptocurrency exchanges, there's a marked move away now to DeFi protocols and cross-chain bridges, presumably because of poorer security, but that's something that really has to be worked on by industry players. The second point here is that none of these figures that we're looking at account for rug pull scams or other third-party frauds perpetrated by wrongdoers in the industry. So for those who aren't familiar with rug pull scams, essentially it concerns a developer launching a project or coin, pumping the value of the coin, withdrawing liquidity, and you see the value of your token just drop to zero. That's a typical rug pull scam. The other sort of fraud that's common in the space is, of course, third-party scams. And what this involves usually is a third party impersonating a blockchain project and trying to trick or defraud users into parting in their cryptocurrencies. And there's so many different avenues in which these scams are being perpetrated, including most pervasive, perhaps, on Telegram, several Telegram chat groups where such scams are being perpetrated by airdrops and giveaways, etc. So that really is just a very brief and quick summary of the scale of the problem for users and developers and people just building on the technology in the industry. Right? And so perhaps before we proceed, I'd like to just ask the audience a quick poll question on whether or not what the chances of recovery are. Let me just give me a second here to launch that poll. So if you're a victim of a hack and your cryptocurrency is stolen, which party do you think you can recover your losses from? The blockchain platform itself, the hackers, or the exchange that converted your stolen crypto to fiat, or all of the above? Would love to see your thoughts.
I think the poll was missing for a second, Kumar. So
no problem.
The poll is up now. And so the question, if I could repeat for the benefit of the audience again, is that assuming you're the victim of a hack of a blockchain project and your cryptocurrency is stolen, now the question is, whose door do you go knocking on? Do you go after the owners or the operators of the platform project? Do you go after the perpetrators themselves, i.e. the hackers? Or number three, do you go after the exchange that converted the stolen crypto into fiat? Now, bear in mind, whatever is stolen crypto will eventually have to go to an exchange to make its way back into fiat, meaning money. And the fourth option is an option which I always used in school for multiple choice, is whenever I see all of the above, I pick all of the above. That's the way I do it. So maybe if you guys could take 30 seconds to answer that, and then Kumar can explain more about it.
So great, Baldeep, everyone followed your school choice. A lot of us did it, at least 35%, all of the above, but an even split across all the other potential options. Interesting outcome. Let's move on to what our proposed solution is. And there is definitely scope to say that the answer is D, all of the above potentially. Of course, there's several factors involved in deciding who to pursue. So this is a proposed war plan in the event of a hack, or in the event you're a victim to a scam or fraud. There are three possible avenues of attack. The first is the victim may pursue the blockchain project itself for recovery of assets. The second, you can hunt down the hackers, perhaps the more exciting option and one that Richie will walk us through shortly. And third, there may be scope to go after the exchange, but of course there are some potential hurdles which comes with pursuing an exchange, and we'll be talking about that as we go along today as well. So I'll just quickly talk about the first part of this war plan, which is an action against the
No, I think you're still on mute from what we see. Anyway, while you're attending to that, let me then go over. Let's start. Um, let's speak briefly about the blockchain project. We'll come back to you in a second, Kumar, but I think we'll then go on to Black Panda. So with the blockchain project, the first point about the blockchain project, just to give you a brief overview before we go to Black Panda, is that when you're chasing after the blockchain project, you got to look at your underlying point of reference, which is your terms and conditions with the blockchain project itself. What do the T's and C's say in terms of where you can take them, where you can pursue the action against them, and the like. So you've got contractual rights against the blockchain project, maybe. That's point number one. Point number two, there is an issue of negligence. Perhaps the blockchain project didn't have the right security measures and so on. Perhaps they didn't behave in the correct manner in which they are meant to, and that creates an liability in negligence. Another way would be breach of trust, which Kumar will come back to at some point. Breach of trust is a very unique concept in law, and it is an important one that I ask everyone to remember, because breach of trust, a trust gives you what we call a tracing remedy. It gives you the ability to go and pinpoint and touch the actual stolen assets itself, and the law gives you additional remedies to get those goods. These are three broad mechanisms of which to go after the blockchain project, and that to get to the blockchain project itself, I think we will have to put that aside for 1 second and think about those causes of action you might have against the blockchain project. Requires information, requires identifying who's involved and so on, and that's where someone like Black Panda, I think, can come in to identify who are the hackers and where have the assets gone to in particular. So maybe, Kumar, if you could put the slides on for Black Panda, and Richie, I'll then hand over the floor to you in terms of the work that you guys do in identifying where crypto stolen assets have gone to.
So I guess I've got a couple of topics to touch on. The first is, the question of how do we identify hackers and trace stolen funds? So with cryptocurrency, admittedly, it's it's a new emerging technology, and it's still going through growing pains in terms of how things are done, operational risks are managed, and how regulation and supervision are carried out. But at the end of the day, when a bad actor does do, let's say, a hack, and they want to remove funds from a victim to their own wallet later on for the purpose of either using it in its, existing form as cryptocurrency, or in transferring it back into fiat or some kind of other currency. Basically, when we do tracing, it involves tracing from the victim's wallet to a destination wallet. And tracing involves trying to find the path through the various ways that the hackers can attempt to hide their footprints. Now, when we try and get to the destination wallet, usually we have a couple of endpoints in mind. The most typical of these would be some kind of KYC node, a node where there is some kind of customer identification that would let us identify the owner of the wallet. So typically this is an exchange. Not all exchanges are fully compliant, but that might be something that changes in future. As cryptocurrency goes through crypto winter, and we decide, we see who gets shaken out and who remains. The regulators seem to be setting their sights on this whole industry and looking for ways to improve transparency, remove some of the attractive elements of cryptocurrency by basically imposing KYC requirements and more record keeping on that front. But that is our objective as well. When we can trace it to an endpoint like that, as opposed to, say, an anonymous wallet or anonymous cold wallet, where there's basically not much that we can do, although I will caveat that a bit later in the presentation. That's what we're trying to trace to, basically a KYC node. So the ways that the hackers can hide their tracks from A to B, typically this is twofold. One is they're trying to hide the nature of the funds so that they don't get flagged by any of the various security mechanisms that are imposed by, say, like the KYC nodes or other intermediaries that handle the funds along the way. And they also try and hide their own identities as well. So that their own identities, of course, blockchain funds, cryptocurrencies, they don't carry information about the owner as such. However, they do carry information about who has previously touched the funds, and that's really what we're thinking of. So we want to, in this aspect, we want to look for ways in which a lump of funds that moves through a blockchain, moves through a cryptocurrency ecosystem, we can say that the owner of the funds from wallet A, even though it's gone through all these intervening wallets and whatever, we still know that it does belong to owner A because of the attributes, the characteristics of the transactions, and the way it exits and stuff like that. So when we do this, we have a couple of tools that we rely on. The first is, I guess, a visualizer, a cryptocurrency or blockchain analysis platform visualization tool. So Chainalysis is one of them. There are other ones that are quite good and used by law enforcement. Basically, the choice of cryptocurrency tracing platform sometimes boils down to a matter of personal preference, the user interface. A lot of times it boils down to the connectivity or the relationship between the user and the operator of the platform, because there's a lot of magic behind the scenes that you need to get comfortable with that. And sometimes it's just due to a matter of cost. So for example, here, the left-hand side, the graphic is from Multigo. It's an open source visualization platform. That means free for individual users. Business users, of course, have to pay for it. And they have some built-in capability to trace cryptocurrencies. And you'll see the way that works is there are nodes or dots that represent wallets. So you've got a wallet address at the very top, and it's that lengthy alphanumeric wallet format. And you've got other nodes. And basically, the magic is the software will help you to trace the movement of funds and the activities of funds movements between nodes. Now,
Richie, can I ask then, would the hackers be able to mask their trails, in terms of, I know you set that map up saying where there's a tracing function, but would a hacker be able to override that somehow by masking it?
Yeah, override, perhaps not like as such override, but they can do things so that they put intervening nodes in that will mess up the picture, make it not so apparent. So that obviously the clearest way that we could see movement of, say, 100 Bitcoin from node A to node B would be in it goes 100, out goes another 100, and you match up the timestamps and all that other stuff, right? So exactly, there's a question, what if they use a mixer? A mixer is just one of these tools that have become popular for basically hiding this trail. So the way a mixer works is when money goes in, it doesn't come back out again, either at the same time or in the same amount. It's clearly identifiable. So like I said, if I have a record of me paying $100 to a receiver at 4:30 p.m., and then someone else has a record of receiving $100 at 4:30 p.m., chances are that's the same transaction. So what a mixer will do is they'll either break that up into smaller pieces. So in traditional money laundering, this would be called smurfing, right? Instead of $100, you've got 98 chunks of $1.10 each or something like that.
But it's still not foolproof, right, Richie? I mean, based on the example, I could just send out 5 tranches of $100 each time, and you wouldn't know which one of it is yours then.
Well, the simple answer is that there are many different ways, many different tools that the hackers or bad actors can use to hide their trail. The magic is that each of these different tracing platforms, Chainalysis, Miracle Science, say Elliptic, all of these companies, right? They have ways of using behavioral analysis is one way to put it, or analysis of patterns and things like that, so that when you see something broken up into 5 pieces, then they'll be looking for 5 pieces that somehow add up to $100, let's say, right? And then that's sort of how they reverse back to trace the flow of funds. There's a lot of effort that goes in, so it's beyond, I guess, the capability of regular folks, unless you're talking, math geniuses and people with built-in supercomputers who could do that. But that's why a lot of this is technology-driven, and it sort of does boil down to magic. When the human analysis comes in, that's actually really where, say, a team like Black Panda or another kind of traditional kind of investigator can come in, because these are tools that are used to mask the trail of funds. But oftentimes when, we're trying to trace funds, we can't get the answers that we want using these traditional tools. That's just simply a fact of life, right? So a lot of these alternative I guess, money laundering mechanisms. They include mixers, they include coin swaps. Services or cross-chain bridges. These are a lot of things that people may have heard recently, right? So cross-chain bridge type thing is where they try and hide their trail by putting in Bitcoin and it goes to the bridge and out it comes onto another blockchain in another cryptocurrency, and they think somehow that's hidden their trail. The magic is if there is a platform that can decode this, then they won't have hidden their trail, right? What they'll end up doing is they'll have to resort to traditional means where we come into the picture. So some of these are, I guess, methodologies like using money mules or false documentation to open up accounts at KYC nodes. So, instead of going to Binance and using Mr. Hacker as my identity to open up an account, I would get someone to use a false identity to open up an account to Binance, and therefore they would be my mule. That would be a good way to beat the system. Not that I'm trying to teach anyone a good way, of course, right? There are things like, say, going through the dark web, using people who are not legitimate, who don't mind breaking the law. Those entities can often exchange funds and do a favor for you. Even gambling or washing your money through alternative operations. That's another way to basically hide your trail as well. So again, I guess instead of delving too much into the technical part of how hackers might go about this, maybe we could skip to the next slide, and I can explain a little bit of what we do to trace beyond this. Because even if the technology fails us, which often it is not as doesn't give us the answer that we want, this is where our other methodologies come in for us to help victims and help our customers, our clients, to trace cryptocurrency.
Understood, Richie. Before we move to the next slide, Kumar, if you could move on to the next slide. I do have a question as to if you can trace. Let's say the best case scenario, you can trace it to a certain person. Would you be able to ever tell where that person is located, which jurisdiction, which country physically that person is in?
Not off the blockchain, no, but that's where our traditional investigative services would come into play. So yeah, there's also a question. I'm sort of looking through the list, like say cold wallets is a topic. Say if they move the money to a cold wallet, that's where eventually, they'll have to move the money back out again. And that's where we'll pick up the trail again. When I say, we trace assets, there are some ways, where maybe the trail goes cold or the trail cannot be followed anymore through the digital, the cyber world. But there's always a trail in the real world because all thieves at the end of the day, they sort of are the same kind of thinkers, and them using digital means, that just happens to be them using a digital tool. They're still thieves. They still behave in the same ways and make the same mistakes. So here on this chart, this is actually a messy case, which is why we picked it. We have a lot of cases that are less messy than this. This is an example of a romance scam, but basically the way that the funds have moved through this system, this criminal ecosystem, and the way we do our own investigation is the same for other kinds of hacks as well. It's basically someone has removed money from the victim and tries to move it into their own control. And they do it through complicated schemes like this. So in this case, the victim was a Japanese individual. They got caught up in a romance scam. So the romance scam was, they were approached with a false identity. The false identity was actually lifted off a stolen identity that the fraudsters took from Instagram. So that's why you see the two pictures on the left-hand side of the screen. They used multiple attractive ladies in this case to target the victim. And usually these kinds of scams are run that way. It's very complex. They have lots of people involved. In the sense of, say, even a hacking group, you'll have hacking groups that are, not often just one people. It's usually a group of people, teams of people, all trying to go after the victim from different angles. So in this case, we have the front person, or I guess it would be the honey on the left side of the chart. This entity basically caught the victim and convinced them to put money into the ecosystem, which is basically the middle part of the diagram. So the middle part of the diagram shows there's traditional bank accounts, cryptocurrency addresses. Our services, our investigative services, involve profiling all of this stuff. So we look at digital forensics to decode emails, instant messages, any kind of digital evidence that we've got. We decipher all of that stuff, and we try and trace the money into the real world. So on the right-hand side is where our findings have come out. This is sanitized, obviously, for various reasons, but basically we've traced them to addresses overseas, companies overseas, individuals, phone numbers overseas. All of this stuff can be targeted through normal ongoing investigation work, as well as law enforcement. Some of these cases that we look at involve serious crimes, such as terrorism, terrorist financing, human trafficking, drugs, all kinds of really nasty stuff. Because basically, although hackers may be maybe the SBF type of individual who's sort of misguided, some of them are actually really bad actors through and through. So this diagram, I think, will hopefully show some of your clients, the bigger picture. When we look for tracing funds, we can't stop at cryptocurrency, because at the end of the day, looking at the blockchain isn't enough to give the answer to people like you, the lawyers, the victims, law enforcement. We have to do the whole picture. And Black Panda offers, that full service. Incident response is where we get called in, but incidents to us can mean hacks. It can mean someone has stolen your keys, you've lost the keys, you have poor cybersecurity. It extends to non-cyber. If you have operational risks, other things, we can provide, or we can help our clients to manage all kinds of risks like that, vulnerabilities.
Excellent. I just wanted to say that lawyers get excited looking at charts like this, where we see arrows and boxes. That's what we do on a daily basis almost. Coming to lawyers, Gavin, let's talk about the legal tools, the legal remedies that are available to hackers. And so I think we can use the word disclosure orders and freezing orders so to avoid technical terms that they've got about.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Kumar, we can hear you once again.
I had such a fancy mic, it just decided to fail on me. So I've reverted to the laptop mic, so that's great. Yeah, let's go on to Gavin. We'd love to hear Gavin's views.
Yep, we're just about to ask Gavin the question then about stolen assets. So once you've identified the stolen assets, they have been traced to the exchange. Black Panda has done a superb job in trying to identify where it's gone to the exchange. Then what? What tools does the law have?
Well, if we're trying to identify the hackers and we're trying to get information, then the key thing is that these exchanges, whilst they started off being totally unregulated, they're now increasingly coming under regulations, and most of them will require, as people on the call who've invested in crypto will know, they'll require you to put up KYC documentation, so passports, proof of address, and that sort of thing, in the same way as a bank would when you're opening an account. So the exchanges are therefore not just crypto exchanges. For the purpose of the lawyers trying to track down the wrongdoers, they're a source of potential information. And law can help can help the victim identify that information and get it from the exchange. There are two types of orders, and I won't go into the technical details as Baldev said, but there are two grounds on which the victim's lawyers could seek to extract that information from the exchange. So an application could be made to court for a third-party disclosure order. Now, to give this some colour, the case that I was involved in a couple of years ago, which is still going on, but the actions against the exchange took place, I think, in autumn and then autumn 2020 and then spring of 21. And what had happened in that case was that a poor victim had 1,400 Bitcoin on an Electrum wallet, which had been compromised by hackers. And when he plugged that Electrum wallet into his laptop after several years of holding those coins on his Electrum Cold wallet, it asked him to update the software on the wallet. And when he clicked yes, the software downloaded malware and transferred, and that malware then transferred out the Bitcoin to the hackers' accounts. using the methods that Richie has eloquently described, the victim's investigators managed to trace that 14 or some of that 1400 Bitcoin into one of the major worldwide exchanges. It wasn't FTX, it was another one. And there was also, when that exchange was approached by lawyers on behalf of the victim, the exchange, the people who responded on behalf of the exchange were based in Singapore. As a result of that, we asked the exchange to voluntarily provide the information. Their standard stock response was that they will not provide any information about account holders, kind of as you'd expect, unless there is a court order or a request from the authorities, namely the police or other prosecution authorities. In this case, actually, the client did have a German police officer, for various reasons I won't go into, who was willing to provide a written request and did so, but the exchange still failed to cooperate. As a result of that, we took legal action against the exchange here in Singapore and managed to get a third-party disclosure order against the exchange from the Singapore courts.
How does that work, Kevin? Because you've got the disclosure orders, but the disclosure orders are not a standalone. All these orders always need to sort of tag on to an action, a main action that you have. But with these problems, you don't know who your perpetrator is. So how does that work?
So yes, this was the first case in Singapore in which an action against persons unknown was considered and allowed. That is something which had been recognised in the English courts, and so the hackers at this stage are obviously not known. That's why you're asking the exchange for the information. But the court was willing to entertain a potential lawsuit against persons unknown, and the exchange is effectively joined as a party to the action in order to provide disclosure of the identity information. So that was how it was structured in terms of a legal claim, Belden.
Excellent. Okay, so let's say you've gone after the exchange, or not gone after. You've asked the exchange for information, and they've given that information in terms of KYC and AML and individuals behind the wallets. What next then?
Well, it's interesting to know what the extent to which the order from the court and which it was willing to grant was pretty extensive. You were able to get both information, so full name, date of birth, address, where the account holder was resident, any email addresses that the exchange was holding for those accounts, and any telephone numbers holding to those accounts. Plus, the court was willing to order that the exchange deliver up to the victim any of the account opening documentation, so passports, ID documents which had been provided for KYC purposes. So this then gave us pretty much individuals who we thought prima facie on its face were either the hackers or they were someone known to the hackers. So as Richie was pointing out earlier, it may be that the account holders at the exchange were not necessarily the hackers. They could have been dupes, or they could have been used, their identities could have been used. In this case, we strongly believe, for various reasons I can't go into, that the account holders at the exchange were either the hackers themselves or contacts known to the hackers and who were intentionally facilitating the theft. So what has happened then is that they have been tracked down in the ordinary way in the real world, and they are now the subject of proceedings in their home jurisdiction in the US.
But you probably want to stop them from dissipating these coins or these tokens even further. So you've identified these individuals, you think they are connected with the scheme. but you still don't know where your coins are, whether they still have the coins or whether they've moved it out to a bank or somewhere else. So if you want to freeze, if you want to stop them from dissipating these assets, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, so as well as the disclosure order, we applied for a freezing order. And at the time, when we first contacted the exchange, most, if not all, the Bitcoin was still being held at the exchange. Sorry, no, there had been a large proportion of the Bitcoin was still in the accounts, but certain amounts of it had been transferred out, and I think it was into Monero, another cryptocurrency. And then presumably Monero has excellent encryption, so I think it's used often to then transfer into fiat currency. But a lot of the Bitcoin that we were concerned with and which we thought was our clients was actually still on the exchange. So which is unusual, because normally a hacker is trying to get it out as quickly as possible and will go through a mixing process, and then we'll get it out into fiat. In this case, there was some still on the exchange, so the court was very happy to order a freezing order over that, which was served on the exchange. And then in respect of the other crypto which had been transferred out, there was a worldwide freezing order to stop transfers or to make the persons unknown, which were now identified, under an obligation at least to stop moving any of that crypto further. Of course, whether they would pay any attention to that, if they're based in the US or wherever they were, is a different matter. But at least we've done as much as we could here in Singapore to get a freeze on some of the assets.
Excellent. Let me take over, bring Kumar back into the fold now that his mic is back on. And we're talking about jurisdictions over here, and I think it's a technical point, but it's also a key point, because if you want to have a fight with someone, you need to know where to have that fight. Let's say you've got an exchange in the Seychelles, incorporated in the Seychelles, or the BVI. You've got the hackers, and you find out that the hackers, or the individuals associated with the hacking account, and they are, let's say they are in America, and you are the victim, you're based in Singapore. So where do you go to take the fight?
Actually, let's ask our audience that question. I feel like this is a talk show, so simple with that interjection, the timing. But yeah, this is certainly something I think that we should ask our audience. And I've prepared another poll just before we go into this complex topic of where exactly we should commence an action. Right, so here are the options: where the victim is domiciled, where the crime itself took place, where the hackers are located, where the stolen crypto is located. This is a bit controversial, given that technically crypto is on a decentralized ledger, distributed ledger, or where the exchange involved is located. It would be great to hear your views on where you think is the best jurisdiction a victim can commence an action.
Is there not an option for all of the above?
No, not this time, because
None of the above?
I don't think it's cost effective to go everywhere. All right, so 39%, 37% now, where the exchange involved is located. It's a tie between where the victim is domiciled, the crime took place, and where the hackers are located. So this really highlights the challenge here in deciding strategy on how to go about and where to commence an action to house your claims. And I think it's important to consider some of the cases actually that deal. Yes, Natalie, that's a great one. Where the hackers have their property located. I wish I'd included that as well. That's absolutely right. But yeah, let's just try and get some guidance from case law, right? So in Ion Science, this is a significant English High Court decision. So there was an ICO fraud, initial coin offering fraud, by a fake entity. The claimant was a company in England, director and shareholder in England, bank account also in England, right? And the court here held that the lex situs of a crypto asset is the place where the person or company who owns it is domiciled. So to put it very simply, where the asset itself is located as a matter of law is where the person who or company who owns it resides in, right? And this is a bit odd because technically the crypto asset isn't centralized, right? It lives on a distributed ledger on the internet. There's no centralized location. But including all the other factors that pointed to England being the proper forum for this dispute, the court also held that the place where the crypto asset is located is where the person who owns it, controls it, is domiciled. That was an interesting factor there in that case. If you go to Janish and against persons unknown, Chef Pierre, a very recent Singapore decision, and this involved a transaction where a Bored Ape NFT was loaned out as collateral on an NFT marketplace called OpenSea. And in this case, the claimant was a Singapore citizen, carried out business in Singapore, owned property in Singapore, many connecting factors to Singapore. The NFT itself, again, it exists as code stored in the Ethereum blockchain, which is a decentralized network. But the court, having regard to all the connecting factors to Singapore, held that it just simply has to take jurisdiction because if not, there wouldn't be an appropriate forum to hear the dispute. I pause there because I slightly disagree with the observation of the judge in this case because technically the transaction took place on OpenSea, and OpenSea is headquartered in New York. Right, so the other potential jurisdiction that could have been relevant is actually New York, where the transaction arguably could have taken place. So there are still options but in this case, given that the claimant had more presence in Singapore, decided to commence an action in the Singapore courts. But what's, I think, even more remarkable is the next decision we're going to talk about, which is CLM versus CLM. So in this case, the plaintiff was a US national. He was partying in Mexico, and he got on a call with some of his friends, and he read out the code to his safe. And I think a few days later, he realizes that his cryptocurrency has been stolen, right? And so he went on this investigation to try and figure out where it went. And he identified 2 exchanges involved. These exchanges were incorporated in Cayman Islands and Seychelles, but they had operations in Singapore, right? And so he decided to commence an action in Singapore because the exchanges had operations in Singapore. And it turns out that once the exchanges had complied with ancillary disclosure orders, he identified at least 4 other people who were involved in the wrongdoing. The 4th and 5th defendants were natural persons whose locations were as yet unknown, but the 6th defendant was an exchange in the US. The 7th defendant was a US payment services provider. And the court held that, or court rather observed that because the 6th and 7th defendants had subsidiaries in Singapore and were likely to comply with future disclosure orders, that was a factor that weighed in the court's favor in holding that Singapore was a proper forum. And this is interesting because these particular entities, although they operated overseas, they held shareholding in subsidiaries in Singapore. And on that basis, the court held that they were domiciled in Singapore. So really the final point here is that in CLM and CLN, the judge cited Siemens, AG, and Holdrick investments, which deals with the threshold to serve proceedings out of jurisdiction. And I won't read out this quote, right? But in essence, the court held that you don't have to decide at a very preliminary stage whether or not Singapore is clearly the right forum, right? Because if you do, you'll be held in jurisdictional limbo. So you're literally 2 things, right? First, it's a much lower threshold. You don't have to decide it conclusively. And second, in a sense, you're kicking the can down the road because it's open to a party later on to dispute jurisdiction. Even though on a preliminary basis, we're saying that, okay, clearly at this stage, Singapore is the right forum. But at least this really goes to show that the Singapore courts are very willing to provide a remedy or take jurisdiction if there's some nexus between the hack and Singapore, and in particular, if the exchange has operations here. I just wanted to highlight that.
So, Kumar, can I ask the question then? Back to the example we started out with. You are based in Singapore, exchange is in the Seychelles, hacker or persons identified as associated with the hacking account is in the UK. Then where would you go? The answer seems to be that you go to the place that is that is connected, but also one that gives you the best shot of getting facilitation from the court, getting assistance from the court. Is that the way to put it?
I want to say the tongue-in-cheek response should be Natalie's answer, which is go where the assets are, which is always literally the million-dollar question. But I think really based on CLM and CLN, it's where you're most likely to get disclosure, where you can succeed in getting disclosure from the exchange and ultimately identify the hackers would be the jurisdiction, I think.
Okay, then let me put the question to Gavin then. Let's say the exchange in that scenario, in your case, the exchange was in China. How would that have made a big difference for you guys?
Just repeat the question, Bella.
Let's say the exchange in this scenario, once again, choosing which jurisdiction to go to, but let's say the exchange, instead of being in Singapore, because it's in Singapore, that's how you got your disclosure orders in the case you spoke about. Yep. Let's say the exchange was in China or Hong Kong.
Yeah, very difficult if it's in China. You know, if the exchange had been a wholly Chinese exchange, I think the client would have been screwed. So the good thing is that in the world of crypto, there has, you know, some of these exchanges, FTX, until FTX imploded, I think that was the fourth or fourth biggest exchange. The top five were hosting a considerable amount of the exchanges that were taking place worldwide. So the hackers have not really sort of cottoned on to the fact that if they go through one of those exchanges, which is has residence or is operations in a country such as Singapore or the UK, then we've got the chance to get those disclosure orders. But if it had been in China, I think we'd have found it very difficult to get those disclosure orders.
Thanks. Yes, I would think so. Most exchanges would be based, I think if you are incorporating a company for tax and other reasons, you tend to do it in the offshore jurisdictions, the Caymans, BVI, the Seychelles, Mauritius, for example. Yeah.
But for credibility reasons, all the exchanges have set up operations in the UK, Singapore, and the US and other European countries. So whilst they may ultimately be owned or the group structure might be originally BVI, they normally have had subsidiaries. So the exchange we had subsidiaries in the UK and Singapore. We were at one stage considering whether we would need to make a disclosure application in Jersey, which is an offshore jurisdiction, a UK offshore jurisdiction. But we decided to go in Singapore because we thought we had a better chance of the Singapore courts accepting jurisdiction, given a few facts that we had, which was the exchange responding to us from Singapore.
Okay, excellent. Let's move on to the last section of the webinar before we can take some questions. And Kumar, I think you've got the unenviable task of explaining this very complicated issue of trust and going after the exchange itself. Over to you.
I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. So the third potential action is against the exchange. And really there are two key issues that we have to consider here. The first is to start with whether the exchange holds the customer's assets on trust. That's the first very fundamental question. And the second is whether or not there's a potential remedy for against the exchange for dishonest assistance in circumstances where they knew basically that stolen assets were transferred to the exchange and they assisted in converting those assets to fiat. So on to the first bucket, right, which is whether assets are held on trust. And I think that we can take guidance again from two key cases. The first is the case of Coin and B2C2. That's a Singapore case. And the second case is Roscoe versus Cryptopia Limited, which is a New Zealand High Court case. So in Coin and B2C2, what happened there is that ultimately the court held that assets weren't held on trust for the benefit of the users. And that's primarily because of two reasons. The first is that the way in which the exchange processed orders. So you have your cryptocurrency on an account on the exchange. But when you place an order, or you place a trade, instead of taking your cryptocurrency from a cold wallet or another wallet, there's a database that sort of fulfills all those orders. And once there's this entry in the database that says, okay, I need to fulfill this order now, the exchange will go and satisfy that order by hooking it up, by taking the assets from another cold wallet or purchasing those assets. So on that basis, the court held that actually this really functions more as a bank deposit account. And more importantly, there was no segregation of the user's assets on the exchange based on how that exchange operated. This wasn't the case in Rusko and Cryptopia Limited. So in Rusko and Cryptopia Limited, it was a bit more straightforward in a sense, because in that case, the exchange operated by directly fulfilling orders with a cold wallet. So there was a direct link between your account and a cold wallet in which your own assets were held. And on that basis, the court there held that, okay, it's possible to infer that there's an intention by how the exchange is conducting their affairs to hold these assets on express trust for the users. That really is, those really are the key points on trust. So,
but what could the users do differently? I mean, if you're a user, you are dealing with the exchange says, these are my terms, this is the way I do my business. What can the user do differently to protect himself, to create this trust so that he can trace the assets subsequently?
The user really, I think the ideal answer would be the user really has to look at how the exchange operates its business, right? So two things. First, look at the terms and conditions. Ensure that as far as possible, there are express references to trust. And no references, unlike the case in Coin, where in the event of insolvency, the assets weren't being held on trust. So there's some wording there. So first protocol, you need to be able to construe the T and C's to ensure that as far as possible, there's an intention there for your assets to be held on trust. The second is you need to shop around for an exchange that actually holds your assets on trust. And I think the MES definitely has a consultation paper out now where one of the suggestions is to actually put this in effect, right? Where exchanges or digital payment token service providers are made to segregate customer assets and incorporate in their T&Cs the fact that they're held on trust. So you have to be selective and a lot more discerning in where you put your money or your cryptocurrency, in a sense.
Excellent.
But
sorry.
I want to talk about the second point, which is whether or not we can go after the exchange for dishonest assistance, right? And that requires us to impute knowledge on the exchange to allege that they knew that, or they ought to have known that the assets that they were handling were misappropriated assets. And I think there is an argument to be made that because most exchanges have to comply with AML obligations, which will usually comprise of transaction monitoring, client due diligence obligations, especially when certain transaction thresholds are reached, right? So if that particular transaction triggers these obligations, then it's certainly arguable that the exchange should be put on notice and would have known, in fact, that the assets were misappropriated. I just wanted to leave that potential argument out there.
I guess the moral of the story, as FTX would tell you, is be careful when you're at exchange, I suppose. Guys, thank you for your valuable insight this evening. Perhaps before we finish off, if the audience has any questions, please feel free to ask. In the meantime, if I could ask our speakers for their closing remarks, and the question I would put forward to all the speakers would be what do you think can be done better in the crypto space to prevent or to mitigate some of these issues that we are seeing? Like Kumar mentioned, the MAS is talking about segregation or considering proposals for the segregation of tokens so that it's easier to trace and track the tokens. Any other suggestions from Richie on a forensic perspective, and Gavin from your experience?
Richie, do you want to go first?
All right, thank you, Gavin. Yeah, I guess from my perspective, maybe it's I'd like to take a client sort of orientation to answer this question rather than say the environment or the infrastructure around crypto. I think for the clients to protect yourselves against crypto crime, cyber crime, keep in mind two things. One is that there's always a human behind the scenes that's causing the problem. Maybe it's a human who has failed in safeguarding your assets. Maybe that's you. And maybe it's a human who has an axe to grind against you and who is looking for ways to harm you. And secondly, crypto is one, I guess it's just one form of currency. So at the end of the day, as we see, even with at the peak of crypto, I guess the peak of the crypto bubble, you still always had to convert crypto back into fiat for any real usage, for any real kind of getting away with it as a criminal or even as a normal person, because there simply aren't that many ways to spend crypto per se. Now, maybe 5 or 10 years later, it'll be different. So keep in mind that crypto is just one way of storing wealth. And there are ways that people have to take that into the open world. And that's where we can come in and help trace assets if they ever get lost.
Kevin, yourself?
For me, I mean, a lot of my clients, I mean, I've been dealing with this case that I was explaining earlier was as I said, sort of a almost pre-COVID case. I think the actual hack was just at the beginning of COVID. But since the crypto crash or the beginning of the crypto winter in the spring of this year, the industry's been just roiled with incident after incident. And a lot of my clients who are trying to make their way in the industry list and they may not be in ICO stage, but they've gone past that, but they're trying to list on new exchanges. They are crying out for regulation. So a lot of the industry participants are wanting the lack of regulation to be changed so that, certainty in the US and the rest of the world over whether these things are going to be regarded as securities, and then the exchanges themselves being licensed entities, and you're not allowed to operate an exchange unless you are licensed in a country and you're complying with traditional KYC type or modified KYC requirements. And then, if you're dealing with an exchange which is in China or in other inaccessible jurisdictions, you're doing so at your own risk.
Okay, actually,
So
Kumar, your concluding remarks?
Yeah, I think really we need regulation that deals directly with the issue of anonymity on the blockchain, right? Because there's several advantages to the technology, but we really have to ask yourself, does it really need to be anonymous? And so I would say that there needs to be AML and KYC requirements for DeFi protocols as well. So it's not just limited to exchanges, but really any project that deals with customers' assets should have these obligations where you identify account holders. And I think that this a broader approach to due diligence and client identification will go towards tackling that issue of anonymity and at least assist everyone in recovery if it comes to that.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you for your valuable insight over the course of this past hour. We've just gone past 6 o'clock, so I'd like to thank our audience as well for their participation. We will be sending through the materials as well as the speakers' profiles after this webinar. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.